Jim Morrison, the Manson murders, and the FBI, plus Jim's private parts. What do all these things have in common? I'm going to unpack all that in this video. First and foremost, to understand why Jim Morrison was as eccentric and erratic as he was, it's important to understand his difficult childhood. Jim Morrison did not have a stable house life. As a matter of fact, Jim Morrison didn't really have a house. He had many houses. The Morrison family relocated around the United States many times during Jim's adolescence. Because the family was moving so frequently, Jim became a bit of a loner, someone who was always in his own head. Another famous person from the 60s who grew up as a loner and was always in his own mind was Charles Manson. Now, of course, it goes without saying that Charles Manson was a horrific person responsible for the deaths of many innocent people. It is interesting to note, however, that there are some parallels between Manson and Morrison. As a matter of fact, the police questioned Jim Morrison after the Manson murders. More on that shortly. Now, Jim's father, George, was an important figure in the U.S. Navy, so much so that George Morrison was directly involved in the famous incident, which led to increased U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. On August 2, 1964, the U.S. Navy and the North Vietnamese Navy exchanged fire. George Morrison, Jim's dad, was in command of American forces during this confrontation. 4 North Vietnamese were killed and 6 more were wounded. On the American side, there were no casualties, but regardless, this incident, now known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, famously gave the Johnson administration the quote-unquote justification they needed to escalate U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Some people find it too much of a coincidence that Jim Morrison, one of the biggest counterculture icons ever, had a father who was not only a prominent member of the U.S. Navy, but who was directly involved in the incident widely regarded as the catalyst for increased U.S. involvement in Vietnam. There is a theory out there that Jim Morrison may have been some sort of a CIA asset, a CIA plant. While I personally don't have a solid opinion on that just yet, Jim Morrison's potential ties to the government is something I'm currently reading on. Jim, of course, is not the only prominent figure from the 60s hippie scene that people believe may have been a government plant. Going back to Charles Manson, there are a lot of people who think he was a CIA asset of some sort. While this has never been confirmed, there is quite a bit of information which does suggest Manson may have had government ties. As mentioned, after the horrific Manson murders in August of '69, the police actually questioned Jim Morrison about the murders. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life-Death Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote, "On August 9, 1969, Charles Manson, frustrated by music industry rejection of his songs and other showbiz snubs, dispatched his witchy young legion into the town, where they butchered movie star Sharon Tate in her Beverly Hills home, which belonged to record producer Terry Melcher. Another victim that was murdered that night on August 9, 1969, was Jim Morrison's former hairstylist, Jay Sebring, along with 4 other victims. Heavy-duty paranoia descended upon the land. About a month later, for reasons that remain unclear, Jim Morrison was questioned by police detectives investigating the Tate LaBianca murders. There was a rumor going around town that Jim had talked about the murders before they happened. Jim may have also been tied to the case through Sebring, or through connections in Topanga, where the Manson family had lived, or through acquaintances with one or more of Charlie's girls. Over the years, several of these still imprisoned women have claimed that they knew Jim Morrison, but similar claims about other contemporary celebrities are considered highly suspect and remain unproven." End quote. Jim Morrison's possible ties to people in Manson's circle is also a subject I'm researching at the moment. For now, however, let's turn our attention back to Jim's childhood and the key events which turned him into the controversial man he became. Jim's father, George Morrison, was often required to move around the U.S. due to his career in the Navy, and thus, from a young age, Jim Morrison grew up accustomed to life on the road. It's as if Jim was on tour with a band from the time he was a kid. Jim was actually quite violent as a kid. I'll be exploring that soon. The divide between Jim Morrison and his dad in many ways is the perfect embodiment of the divide between the World War II generation and the hippie generation. George Morrison was a clean-cut military man, whereas Jim Morrison is arguably the most famous American figure from the 60s hippie scene. He's certainly one of the most famous. This divide between generations, the cultural conflict between authority and rebellion, really culminated on March 1st, 1969. On that date, the Doors had their most infamous concert. On March 1st in Miami, in front of a packed house, Jim Morrison allegedly pulled out his private. To this day, there is no definitive evidence to either prove or disprove whether or not Jim actually did it. But regardless, this alleged incident became a massive issue. 4 days after the show, 6 warrants were issued for Jim Morrison on obscenity charges, and soon after that, Jim gave himself up to the FBI in Los Angeles. This situation ended up becoming a years-long legal battle, which is ultimately one of the reasons Jim Morrison moved to France, where he ended up dying. Part of Jim's logic to leave the US was to get away from the legal proceedings. It's a crazy story, and I'll be sharing the details of that legal battle and the drama around it with you here in the second half of this video. But first, let's take a deep dive into the history of Jim Morrison's tumultuous childhood. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life Death Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote, "Anyone inquiring more than superficially into Jim Morrison's life immediately realizes that the story of his childhood is crucial to understanding what happened to him later. First, he remained very childish his entire life. Of course, rock stars who came to fame and fortune very young, what else was there for them to do? Second, when Jim joined the Doors and began performing in public, he abruptly severed all ties with his family and never saw his parents again. Third, his early act was a graphic, pull-no-punches rewrite of the ancient Oedipus legend, in which he sang of killing his father and sleeping with his mother in front of tens of thousands of his fans. Why did Jim Morrison hate his parents so much? Why did he hate himself? How was he able to create such pure American music out of his own anguish? Why did he end up with a crazy girlfriend who was an even heavier character than himself, who tried in vain to control him, who may have killed him in the end? How could it have happened that this cool, talented guy, one of the great artists of his generation, morphed into a monster and then immolated himself? The problem with answering these questions is that Jim Morrison's troubled and problematic post-World War II childhood within the sheltered, close-knit world of military families has been one of his story's most closely guarded mysteries. His parents, Admiral George S. Morrison and Clara Clark Morrison, have never commented publicly on their notorious firstborn son as of the time of this printing in June of 2005. Jim's brother and sister have been equally reluctant to speak of their brother. Whether fear of scrutiny or a desire for privacy drives this steely reticence, any inquiries to the Morrison family concerning the late rock star and poet Jim Morrison are parried by California attorneys claiming to represent his estate. The Morrison's family wall of silence has mirrored Jim's childhood, especially his tense, unhappy adolescence, since the day he died. This shouldn't be surprising, since Jim Morrison tried to convince the media that his parents were dead, and that his siblings never existed. He probably thought he was doing them a favor. Here's what is known about Jim's first 20 years. His father, George Stephen Morrison, known as Steve, was born in Georgia in 1920 and raised in Leesburg, Florida. The Morrison family was descended from Scottish settlers who arrived in America in the late 18th century. The name Morrison is thought by some scholars to derive from the Latin root of Moorish. In Roman times, soldiers from far-flung provinces were moved around to guard different parts of the empire. Thus, Celtic troops from Britain would be sent to guard Morocco, while Moors from North Africa maintained order in Britain. Folklorists say, for example, that the quaint English custom of the Moorish dance can be traced back to a Moorish antecedent. In this context, Morrison could mean Moor's son. Late in his life, Jim would visit Morocco at least twice, searching for something he was unable to describe to his traveling companions. Steve Morrison's parents were hard-working, God-fearing, non-drinking Southern Presbyterians, and Steve followed the family's tradition of military service and entered the U.S. Naval Academy in the late 1930s. He was a trim young man, short of stature and serious, with an air of quiet authority. With World War II about to begin, his class was hustled through an early graduation in 1941, and Steve Morrison was posted to Hawaii for flight training. Later that year, just before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he met Clara Clark at a military dance. Blonde, bubbly, very pretty, and slightly heavy, she was the daughter of a Wisconsin lawyer and political maverick who defended union activists and had run for political office as a socialist candidate. It is interesting that Jim Morrison's maternal grandfather came from the great populist, progressive, socialist strain of American radicalism, a powerful sector of dissent and anger that challenged the two-party establishment from a strong political base in the upper Midwest and produced national leaders like Robert La Follette. After a brief and war-torn courtship typical of thousands of young couples in that dangerous time, Steve Morrison and Clara Clark were married in April of 1942. They moved to Pensacola, Florida, where Steve continued flight training before shipping out on a vessel laying mines in the waters around Alaska. Their first child, named James Douglas Morrison, was born in Melbourne on Florida's Atlantic coast near Cape Canaveral on December 8, 1943, amid the greatest burst of military energy his country ever experienced. He was called Jimmy by his father, an answer to that name all his life, at least to those who knew him intimately. His father was soon flying Hellcat fighters in the South Pacific and spent the next 18 months on duty. While her husband was overseas, Clara lived with her husband's parents, Paul and Caroline Morrison, who operated a laundry in Clearwater on the Gulf of Mexico. Jimmy lived in his grandparents' house until he was 3, and Clearwater remained the family's hometown of record during Jimmy's childhood. Steve Morrison emerged from the war a decorated Navy pilot and an ambitious officer devoted to his career. His first post-war assignment was in Washington, but, determined to rise in the naval hierarchy, he moved his young family around with very little notice as he earned promotions and his assignments changed. Correctly guessing in 1947 that quick advancement lay in the new technologies that were reshaping the world, Steve Morrison transferred into nuclear weapons systems in the period when the hydrogen bomb was being developed at Los Alamos and tested at the White Sands Proving Grounds in the deserts of New Mexico. His new duties required a high-level security clearance that specified that his work was never discussed at home. Obscured by official secrecy, references to Lieutenant Morrison's duties during this period are still heavily censored in copies of his naval records made available to the public. All that is known about this era is that the Morrison family lived in naval housing in the vicinity of Albuquerque. Jim's sister, Anne, was born there when he was 3 years old. If his sister's arrival was traumatic for the quiet, only child, something else happened in New Mexico that left a profoundly vivid impression on Jimmy. Early one morning, the family was driving in the desert somewhere between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. According to Jim, his mother and father were in the car along with his grandparents. At one point, his father pulled off to the side of the 2-lane road, and he and Jimmy's grandfather got out of the car. Jimmy looked up and saw the grisly remains of a very recent head-on collision between another car and a truck carrying some Pueblo or Hopi Indians. Scattered on Don's highway bleeding, as he later famously remembered. Dead and injured people were lying on the road, and from somewhere rose the anguished voice of a woman wailing in pain and hysteria. Fascinated by the bloody spectacle, Jimmy tried to get out of the car to follow his father, but his mother held him back. So Jimmy pressed his face to the window, taking in the gory aftermath of the fatal accident. His grandmother blurted that she'd always heard that Indians didn't cry, but these people were wailing in anguish. Jimmy shuddered and strained to get a last look at the carnage as his father climbed back in the car and pulled onto the road again. A few miles farther, they stopped at a filling station and called the highway patrol and an ambulance. Jimmy was visibly disturbed and kept asking questions. He got so upset that his father finally said, "Jimmy, it didn't really happen, it was just a bad dream." But he never forgot the dying Indians. "It was the first time I discovered death," he recounted many years later, as tape rolled in a darkened West Hollywood recording studio. "I'm just this little, like a child is a flower man, whose head is just floating in the breeze. But the reaction I get now, looking back, is that possibly the soul of one of those Indians, maybe several of them, just ran over and jumped into my brain. It's not a ghost story, man. It's something that really means something to me." After this encounter on a desert highway, Jimmy began to wet his bed at night. As an adult, he remembered going to his mother's bed when it happened, and being forced to go back to his room and sleep in wet sheets. Shame City. He tried to hide it when it happened, but she always found out. Then, he started to be afraid to sleep in his own bed at all. Some nights he fell asleep curled in a ball on the floor. The bedwetting may also have been connected to a childhood bout with rheumatic fever, which Jim told his doctor about in 1970. This illness might have, additionally, weakened Jimmy's heart. If Jim Morrison's trusted lawyer is to be believed, Jimmy was introduced early to sexuality. In 1969, while preparing for the obscenity and lewd conduct trial that could have resulted in a prison term for his client, Beverly Hills attorney Max Fink debriefed Jim Morrison on his sexual history. According to a transcript of a taped interview later conducted by Fink's wife, Margaret, the lawyer said that he asked Jim why he had chosen to expose himself on stage in his home state of Florida. "I thought it was a good way to pay homage to my parents," Jim replied. Taken aback and mindful of the abyss that seemed to separate Jim Morrison from his family, Fink then asked what his parents had done to him. Jim reportedly mentioned the bedwetting trauma, then let slip that he'd been molested by a man when he was a boy. Jim refused to tell Max Fink who molested him, except to say it was someone close to the family. When Jimmy tried to tell his mother, Fink claimed, she had gotten angry, called him a liar, and insisted such a thing never could have happened. Fink said that Jimmy began to cry as he told him the story, and claimed that Jim had said that he could never forgive his mother for this. For the record, the Morrison family's attorneys categorically denied that any of these incidents or this alleged behavior ever occurred. In 1948, the family moved again, to Los Altos in Northern California. Here, Jimmy Morrison started public school as a shy and chubby boy who hated getting on the bus in the morning. Cold War paranoia was in the air amid fear of nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. School children of Jimmy's generation were indoctrinated about the omnipresent threat of thermonuclear annihilation and required to practice duck and cover routines during monthly air raid drills, sometimes squatting under their desks, sometimes lining the darkened halls of their school buildings to be beyond the range of shattering glass as phantom A-bombs pulverized their world. Television, viewed on tiny 7-inch black and white screens, made a deep impression on Jimmy. In second grade, Jimmy and his buddy Jeff Morehouse, another son of a Navy family whose wanderings roughly kept pace with the Morrisons, were avid viewers of Dumont's Captain Video and paid up memberships of his fan club, the Video Rangers. Jimmy's younger brother Andrew was born in Los Altos the following year, 1949. Then this fairly typical Navy family's transient wandering began in earnest. They went back to Washington, D.C. for a year before moving to Claremont, California, where they lived while Steve Morrison was serving in Korea. Jim attended Longfellow Elementary School. In 6th grade, he was a slightly chubby, asthmatic natural leader, the best kickballer in the school, and president of the student council, which required him to open morning assemblies by reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. But then Jimmy got in trouble. He was asked to leave his Cub Scout pack after he refused to follow directions and was unruly with the den mother. In 1955, the Morrisons returned to Albuquerque, New Mexico, where, family members recall, they noticed a change in Jimmy. He gave up his piano lessons and refused to spend time with the family. Living on the edge of the desert, Jimmy became fascinated with the mysterious, prehistoric-looking desert reptiles, lizards, snakes, armadillos, that scurried around the hot, dry landscape. The horned toads fascinated him, little scaly dragons with flicking tongues and nightmare eyes. He hunted them down, seeking their lairs, reading books about them. Desert reptiles became Jim's personal totem, making dozens of appearances in his notebooks on their way to what became a national fetishization at the behest of the future Lizard King. In 1955, Commander Steve Morris was assigned to the aircraft carrier USS Midway, and the family relocated again, this time to San Francisco. They moved into a big shingled home in suburban Alameda, where Jimmy began the 8th grade amid the convulsion birth of rock and roll and the epic milestones of juvenile delinquency. Elvis censored on Ed Sullivan, Bill Haley's irresistible Rock Around the Clock, Little Richard's savage jungle rhythms, Fats Domino's gut-buck New Orleans R&B, Chuck Berry's clever 3-minute high school anthems, black leather motorcycle jackets, switchblade knives, a James Dean maelstrom of 1950s rebellion amid Eisenhower-era conformity, repressed sexuality, and the political stresses and apocalyptic threats of the Cold War. Experts have long observed that some children of military families may be at risk for various problems, socially and psychological disorders. Military families are called upon to move often and on short notice. There isn't much time to cultivate friendships before the family moves on to the next post or assignment. In the Navy, with the ambitious on-the-move father often away at sea, the mothers did the bulk of the child raising and often had to cope with rootlessness, emotional disorders, and alcoholism. Jimmy's family moved 4 times before he was 4 years old. And this lack of stability may have engendered a physical restlessness and a sense of profound alienation that stayed with Jim Morrison for the rest of his life. The adult Jim Morrison often didn't know where he would sleep at night, and he preferred it that way. Even after the royalty checks for Light My Fire started in 1967, Jimmy never owned a house or rented an apartment, preferring instead to live with girlfriends, crash in motels, or just pass out on the beat-up sofa at the door's office. Discipline was a problem for Jimmy, and the despair of his mother. Resentment, on the boy's part, was built into the situation. An ambitious officer had to put the Navy ahead of his family. It was the way things were in the services, and the families had to accept it. With his father mostly absent, his mother was the authority figure in the family constellation. She was all he had to rebel against. When his father came home from sea duty, Jimmy would overhear his mother complaining bitterly to his father about him, enumerating all his mistakes, malicious pranks, and screw-ups. Years later, Jimmy's friends wondered why he liked to throw darts at naked Playboy pinups, taped upside down on his bedroom walls. When his father was home, the atmosphere was often tense. Steve Morrison was known in the Navy as a charming, soft-spoken, forceful, and extremely intelligent man. At home, this battle-tested sea officer tended to bark orders at his children. Is it any wonder that 10 years later, his son created the Vietnam-era's greatest anti-war song, The Unknown Soldier? Jim's younger brother told interviewer Jerry Hopkins that Clara bossed Steve around at the home, and was clearly the dominant personality in the family. Early on, the couple had decided not to hit their children, so punishment was dished out verbally, with, in Jimmy's case at least, lashes of guilt and shame added to the standard military dress down. Andy Morrison said that while this would make him cry, Jimmy took this verbal punishment with dry eyes. Jimmy's behavior was a family flashpoint, with his mother as the lightning rod and designated scapegoat. In 1969, at a chaotic Doors concert in Seattle, a drunk and upset Jim Morrison waved the band to a ragged halt, stopped the show, and told the audience, "I've been reading about the problems kids have with their parents. Yeah, that's right. And I'm here to tell you, I didn't get enough love as a kid." Intelligent and articulate, Jimmy also had a dirty mind and a vivid imagination, and he'd often blurt out things in school that got him in trouble. An early pastime was cutting up comic books to rearrange Donald Duck and Daisy in sexual positions with new dialogue. When Mad magazine began publishing its surreal parodies and sick humor in 1956, Jimmy was an early subscriber. He read his issues of Mad till the pages wore out and tried to duplicate the harsh comic screams and outbursts that peppered the texts, driving everyone around him crazy. Jimmy's slouched deportment, extreme lack of eye contact, and sarcastic and insolent attitude drove his parents to distraction. His public antics, nose-picking, spitballs, snide remarks embarrassed the family at Navy functions, and they soon learned to leave him at home when they could. Andy Morrison indicated that Jim began to bully his siblings when he was about 13. His brothers suffered the most. Andy would be watching TV, and Jimmy would lumber in, get him in a headlock, turn him over, sit on his head, and fart in his face. Or pin him down and let a gob of spit hang over his face. Outdoors, Jimmy would pick up a rock and tell his brother, "I'll give you 10, which meant Andy should start running. The little boy learned quickly that Jimmy wasn't kidding. He would throw the rock. In 1955, the Morrisons were on a ski holiday when Jimmy put his brother and sister on a toboggan and pushed off downhill, aiming for the side of a barn. The sled picked up speed, but Jimmy didn't brake. Faster, faster. His sister started crying. His mother was shouting. A horrified Steve Morrison had to sprint to save his children from injury. Jimmy told his furious, disbelieving father that he'd only been kidding around. Conventional wisdom might nominate Jim Morrison as a poster child for the instability of military families. The lack of roots, the father's continual absence, the mother's uneven discipline, the difficulties that a bright but socially isolated child encountered in receiving approval from friends, teachers, and parents all can be used to explain Jim's urges to rebel in order to get the attention he needed. Yet, some observers counter that these peripatetic military families form a larger, extended family that often provides a secure enclave for its own and produces flexible, well-adjusted children. Military families often move together, and the women that kept these families going amid such dislocation often forged bonds that survive for years and even for generations. Jimmy Morrison was obviously exceptional, a piece of work, a pistol. No one could really control him. He was a kid with a rocket in his pocket. Early on, Jimmy learned how to push people's buttons to get the recognition he craved. Later on, as his father rose in the ranks and was able to spend more time at home, he reasserted his role in the family with a program of strict rules and discipline, which was deeply resented by both Andy and Jimmy. Several ideas taken from the fields of psychology and child development might help to illuminate Jim Morrison's behavior later in life. Attachment theory, for instance, suggests that children who receive insensitive, neglectful, or inconsistent care can develop difficulties with controlling their emotions and often turn to drugs and alcohol to soothe themselves. Such children often have trouble with trusting other people and maintaining consistent relationships, and may also become impossible to control. They often exaggerate their behavior to get the attention they crave, with negative attention being better than none. Insensitive or neglectful care can also result in young children relying upon fantasies of grandiosity to protect against anxiety. Some display a tendency to break away from their families prematurely. This independence can make them feel powerful and untouchable, as if nothing will hurt them. As they grow, unprotected, they become self-destructive, accident-prone, and are often the victims of their own poor judgment. While no one can say for certain that Jim Morrison fit into all these criteria, the way he conducted himself later on makes anyone interested in him wonder what lay beneath his permanent state of rebellion. In 1955, Jimmy went to see James Dean in the movie Rebel Without a Cause. Rebel, directed by Nicholas Ray, was the archetypal juvenile delinquency film, pitching its restless hero Jim, called Jimbo by his alcoholic father, into an affluent California high school milieu of anxiety, conflict, and despair. Dean's riveting performance as the rebel Jim was set against visually exotic Los Angeles locations like the Observatory in Griffith Park, and Sal Minio's tragic sacrificial death at the end of the film made a deep impression on Jimmy. Rebel Without a Cause also began Jim Morrison's deep and obsessive love of movies, and his often stated desire to learn how to make them. Rebel is the first film mentioned in Jim's surviving notebooks. He also mentions Giant, James Dean's next film, released the following year after Dean's death in a car crash. It's also possible that the movies, especially the westerns that flooded American theaters in the 50s, played a crucial role in moving Jim to write. His first poem, Pony Express, now lost, was probably based on a Hollywood Western that he caught at a Saturday afternoon matinee while living in Alameda. It was definitely in Alameda that Jim Morrison first caught the beatnik poetry virus, which infected him for the rest of his life. From 1956 to 1958, the Morrisons lived in a big shingled house with an Edwardian turret at 1717 Alameda Avenue in the leafy island suburb of Alameda, the site of the Navy's biggest air station. It was a relatively quiet time in Jim's life. His mother was very content there and was fondly remembered by neighbors, and would subsequently prove to be highly influential in terms of Jim's artistic aspirations. Jim lived by himself in an attic room at the top of the old house, listening to Elvis and Ricky Nelson, while downstairs his mother played her own music, Harry Belafonte, Frank Sinatra, and the original cast albums from South Pacific and My Fair Lady. Jim was popular in school, darkly handsome and no longer chubby, friendly and very funny, able to banter with teachers who were impressed with the reading level and intelligence rarely encountered in young teenagers. At 13, Jim's favorite writer was Norman Mailer, and he could roll out entire Mad Magazine parodies from memory. Yet his school records indicate his teachers' frustrations at Jim's hyperactivity, and in some classes he was forced to sit alone so he wouldn't bother the other students or disrupt the class with his loud interjections and joke accents. Inspired by Mad and the other satiric magazines of the new sick humor genre, Cracked, Sick, Thrump, etc., Jim's notebook sketches became wilder and more deeply cynical. He specialized in obscene drawings of people with surgically exaggerated sexual organs, obsessively inking in bodily fluids. Jimmy spent hours in his quiet attic room cutting and pasting comics into ever more complex lewd collages, relettering the text, going the sick humor mags one step further. His best friend in Alameda was a street-smart neighbor his age, Fudd Ford, who was as reckless and fun-loving as Jimmy was. Jim had access to the Navy's gyms, pools, and athletic facilities, and the boys would get into trouble on the diving board at the officers' club swimming pool and embarrass the family. Ford said that Jimmy's father beat him with his belt for one of these incidents when some officers' wives felt they'd been insulted. All the streets in Alameda led down to the beach, so in the warm months there was a lot of swimming and clowning around. There was a pretty girl they used to go swimming with. Jimmy discovered a way to sneak into her family's boathouse so they could watch her change into her swimsuit. In September of 1957, Jimmy started the 9th grade at Alameda High. He made the swim team, specializing in the butterfly stroke. He was good in class and always had the answers even though he never put his hand in the air. He was a charismatic clown, a troublemaker, very funny and loud, a clever mimic and practical joker whose grating outrageous pranks caused Morrison stories to float around the school 10 years before they surfaced in the media. One of his favorite stunts was to pretend to collapse on the staircase at school and lie there unconscious, while the others had to step around him. He did this a lot at Alameda, and apparently kept it up at his next school since it was a major attention grabber. It was like Jimmy's big joke. Classmates recalled that Jimmy would actually lie there a long time, according to Fudd Ford, pretending he was dead, seemingly oblivious to attempts to rouse him. When he was satisfied that the game was played out, he'd pick himself and his books up off the floor, accept the inevitable detention ticket from the hall monitors, and carry on with his usual smirk and swagger. But was this really a joke? Or was this Jimmy's method of faking his way through a mortifying disorder that left him prostrate on the floor, with embarrassing minutes lost from his life? Or was it what the ancients called the falling sickness, the malady of kings and prophets? Anyone familiar with Jim Morrison's later life and career knows that losing consciousness and passing out was a regular occurrence for him. He fainted or fell down during rehearsals, recording sessions, photo shoots. He collapsed during concerts, poetry readings, bar crawls. He passed out on car rides, in airports, and during plane trips. Shattering theatrical collapses were incorporated into the Doors stage act, a drama Jim Morrison later refined into the apex of rock theater. Was it all really an act? Put together, the anecdotal and visual evidence could suggest that Jim Morrison suffered an undiagnosed case of petit mal epilepsy that may have begun at the age of 14, if not earlier. In high school, it cost him a lot of time in the principal's office, and everyone talked about Jim Morrison and all the funny, outrageous stuff he liked to pull. Jim started 10th grade in the fall of 1958, but he preferred to cut school and visit beatnik hangouts in San Francisco. The year earlier, two significant events had shaken America. First, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first satellite to orbit the Earth. This sensational event provoked spasms of American self-doubt and recriminations about being beaten into space by the Russians. It began the so-called missile gap debate that later helped put John Kennedy in the White House. The second event was the publication of Jack Kerouac's second novel, On the Road, the stream of consciousness saga of existentially aware youth adrift on the vast highways and midnight streets of American cities that turned an entire generation onto the beat subculture. The book became a bestseller and media icon and cracked the corporate conformist facade of the 1950s wide open. On America's two coasts, Sputnik anxiety was allayed by beatnik cool, offering an alternative way of righteous existence in the late 50s. The beats traced their style to French symbolist poets, existentialist philosophers, and Zen masters. Jazz, drugs, nonconformity, and Buddhism were cool. Gray flannel suits were uncool. Beat writers like Kerouac in the West Coast, William Burroughs in Paris, and Allen Ginsberg in New York became overnight cultural stars. The beat poets were the legatees of Dylan Thomas, the brilliant Welsh poet whose magical Celtic cadences and lush imagery had spread via the new technology of long-playing phonograph records as much as through printed books before he drank himself to death in Greenwich Village in 1953. They were also in the tradition of radical American writers like Walt Whitman and Mark Twain, and modernist poets like William Carlos Williams, with whom Ginsberg particularly identified. In the beat universe, Paris was philosophy, New York was jazz, and San Francisco was poetry. Ginsberg called this flowering the San Francisco Renaissance. Often accompanied by bongo drummers, star beatniks could be heard declaiming in the jazz club 7 nights a week. Allen Ginsberg premiered his beat epic Howl in San Francisco in 1955, and many of the other beats often gave public readings of new work in the coffee houses, art galleries, and bookstores. San Francisco was the third corner of the Beat International, a city where poets, not athletes, were local heroes. In San Francisco and neighboring Sausalito and North Beach, poetry ruled. When Jimmy and Fudd skipped school and headed into the city, their first stop was usually Ferlinghetti's City Lights book at 261 Columbus Avenue. A sign in the window boasted banned books. Jimmy liked to hang out there in his beatnik uniform of sweatshirt, sandals, and jeans, hoping to meet any of the poets who might show up. Once Jimmy said hello to Ferlinghetti, and when the poet and the author of A Coney Island of the Mind returned his greeting, Jimmy turned red with pleasure. He and Fudd would go to Stairway Records in Oakland to buy Dylan Thomas LPs on Caedmon, or comedy albums by Tom Lehrer or Lenny Brentz. Fudd took Jimmy to Duo Records, an R&B record store in Oakland, where Jimmy first heard Chicago blues stars Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, and New Orleans legends like Professor Longhair. Jimmy and Fudd read On the Road and plunged into its Beat Generation dreams. Jimmy fell in love with Dean Moriarty's ferocious American energy and Kerouac's concept of Dean as one of the mad ones, the ones who are mad to live, mad to talk, mad to be saved, desirous of everything at the same time, the ones who never yawn or say a commonplace thing, but burn, burn, burn like fabulous Roman candles, exploding like spiders across the stars. He practiced Dean's speed-addled laugh, he, until it made his mother nuts. Jimmy's facial hair began to grow, and he tried to develop a proper beatnik goatee until his mother ordered him to shave it off and get a haircut too. She would shout at Jim and he'd just laugh at her. Once she went to grab him and he put her into a headlock and, still laughing, grabbed a pen and scribbled on her arm. Even Clara had to laugh at this. "You don't fight fair," she yelled at her son. As the school year progressed, Jimmy kept up his serial provocations. Because he was so funny and had this weird presence, he was the kind of kid who could get away with being a jerk and no one would want to call him on it. But he also had an unexpected, compassionate side. He had a classmate, Richard Slaymaker, who was seriously ill with leukemia. Jimmy liked to visit him after school, bringing him comics and comedy records to keep his spirits up. He'd take Richard for walks in his wheelchair and do wheelies with him. It seemed to Fudd that Jimmy, who was fascinated with death, was almost studying Richard as the disease progressed and his skin turned different colors. When he died after 6 months of almost daily visits, Jim Morrison cried. Late in 1958, halfway through the school year, Steve Morrison was promoted to captain and reassigned. His parents told Jimmy that the family was moving to Alexandria, Virginia, right after Christmas. According to Fudd Ford, Jimmy was crushed and didn't want to go. On the last day of classes, Ford said Jimmy walked up to the homeroom teacher's desk and announced that his family was moving away and that he wanted to leave with a bang. Then he lit a cherry bomb and sauntered out of the room before it exploded. Jimmy came over to Fudd's house to say goodbye on the day the Morrisons left Alameda. Then Jimmy got in the captain's ugly green Packard and didn't look back as his father pulled away. Fudd Ford would later recall, Jimmy felt bad because he didn't want to go to Virginia. It was one of the few times in my childhood that I cried. They were taking my best friend away. Jimmy was sent to Virginia ahead of the rest of the family so he could resume high school there in January of 1959. For a few weeks, he stayed with the Morehouse family, who had a son, Jeff, his own age. It would be 5 years before Jimmy was able to return to his beloved California for good. End quote. Now, as mentioned off the top of this video, the infamous incident in Miami from March 1st of 1969, where Jim allegedly pulled out his private during a door show, resulted in a major years-long battle involving Jim Morrison, the FBI, and other government bodies. Here's the full story. This is also from Life Death Legend by Stephen Davis. Quote, "It was late February 1969 and the Doors were going back on tour. The plan was for Jim Morrison and Pamela Corson to fly to Miami together. But on the last day of February, as they were packing their bags, Jim and Pam got into a horrendous fight. Jim Morrison was extremely upset. In the limo on the way to the airport, the fight escalated into near violence, and Jim told Pam that she had to go home. She wasn't coming along. Jim would go to Miami and on to Jamaica by himself. Jim Morrison was furious now, and some band, was going to pay dearly. A few weeks earlier, the students at the University of Miami had been polled to find out their favorite rock group, which would be invited to play at the school just prior to spring break. The students chose The Doors, and the band had been invited to play at the Convocation Hall in Miami Beach. But the band's management accepted instead a better offer of $25,000 from local Miami promoters, who had more experience putting on rock shows. The Doors' problems in Miami started days before the band left Los Angeles. The local promoters, who ran The Image, Miami's Electric Ballroom, had a bad reputation. Other California bands told Doors manager Bill Siddons that they had been ripped off by The Image, which oversold halls and underreported gross ticket sales. On Saturday, March 1st, 1969, the Doors and their gear flew to Miami without Jim, who missed the flight. Bill Siddons waited at LAX until Jim showed up and sent Pamela home. As Siddons recalls, "We found a flight that went through New Orleans where we had a couple of drinks at the airport bar. By the time we got to Miami, I noticed that Jim's facial muscles had slackened, the only way I could tell how drunk he was. So I knew he was real drunk on the way to the gig." The Miami promoters had met the earlier plane and loaded the Doors' brand new tour equipment into their truck. When Siddons arrived, hours later, with a stone-drunk Jim, the Doors' booking agent informed Siddons that the promoters had removed the seats from the so-called Dinner Key Auditorium, in reality, an old seaplane hangar reeking of filth and damp, and had oversold the hall by thousands of tickets. When Siddons, backed up by his black detectives, threatened that the Doors wouldn't play, the promoter and his brother, a karate black belt supervising a thuggish crew, countered that the Doors wouldn't see their expensive new equipment again unless they appeared as contracted that night. Siddons told an interviewer later that the brothers threatened him if the band didn't play. No one said a word as Jim staggered into the dressing room. Jim was heavily bearded and wore a full black ensemble with a silver cross around his neck and a black leather broad-brimmed hat banded with a silver skull and crossbones pulled down over his blazing eyes. He looked about as dread as it was possible for a rock star to look in 1969. Jim Morrison was home, back in Florida for the first time in years. He was about as drunk as one could be and still put on a rough semblance of a rock show. Jim checked out the audience before he went on. Uncounted thousands of kids, mostly teenagers, crammed against a flimsy stage at one end of an evil-smelling old barn. Jim was, unwisely, briefed on the contentious, extortionate vibes of the show, the dodgy promoters, the threats. The band's agent said that it was the worst venue he'd ever seen. Vince Triner warned the band that the stage was poorly built and could collapse. By showtime, Jim was mad as hell and totally liquored up. He proceeded to destroy his career in his family's home state. The worst and one of the most important rock concerts in history started late. John Densmore noticed immediately that the stage was shaking. Promoter Ken Collier, flashing the V-fingered peace sign, introduced the band by asking the audience to keep it cool. A tape made by an audience member captured a series of off-key harmonica notes played by Jim as the band tuned up on stage. Thousands of Kodak Instamatics flashed like lightning bolts. Kids were shouting stuff at Jim, and he responded, "Yeah, okay, right on, looky here. I ain't talking about no revolution, and I ain't talking about no demonstration. I'm talking about having a good time," Jim shouted. He told the crowd they all should come to LA that summer and rub their toes in the sand. Then he pumped it up. "Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready?" Then the Doors started pounding out Backdoor Man. Robbie Krieger recalls the following. Jim started rapping Rock is Dead instead of singing. He was pissed off. People were expecting a freak show instead of rock and roll when they came to see the Doors, and he hated this. He was venting his anger on this audience. End quote. Jim began cursing and shouting obscenities. The band got through the first two verses and into Robbie's solo. Someone threw a plastic bottle of orange Dayglow paint, which burst on the stage, splattering Jim and Robbie. Jim was now making sexual remarks towards the audience. He then started soliciting people from the audience. "Hey, listen, I'm lonely. I need some love. Come on." As Jim invited the audience onto the stage to give him love, the band shifted into 5-1. Jim managed the first two verses of the song, and then Robbie played his spiky guitar solo. Jim, enraged, started cursing even more now towards the audience. Jim paused as John Densmore pounded on, and the audience noise rose to howls of protest and alarm. Jim Morrison went on. "Maybe you love getting pushed around. You love it, don't you?" Jim Morrison jumped back into singing 5-1. "Your ballroom days are over." And then he continued talking to the audience. Hey, I'm not talking about no revolution, no demonstration. I'm talking about getting out in the streets. I'm talking about having some fun. I'm talking about dancing. I'm talking about loving your neighbor until it hurts. The audience at this point had turned into a churning tidal mass of flesh. The band started Touch Me, but Jim wasn't in the mood. He took off his leather coat and threw it into the crowd. He traded hats with a cop and then threw both of them into the crowd. The band kept trying to play Touch Me. Hey, wait a minute. Hey, wait a minute. This is all messed up. You blew it too fast. Wait a minute. I'm not going to go on. The band kept playing, but Jim was adamant. Now, wait a minute. I'm not going to take this. I'm copping out, man. Ray Manzarek stopped playing, then started again and stopped when Jim wouldn't sing. The band started up Love Me Two Times, which Jim performed in a dead monotone. He then began to make obscene sexual gestures on stage. The band then went into When the Music's Over, and Jim sang as if he were underwater, slurring his lyrics to incomprehensibility. Then Jim began ranting again. Hey, listen, I used to think this whole thing was a big joke. I used to think it was something to laugh about. And then the last couple of nights, I met some people who were doing something. They're doing something, and I want to get on that trip. I want to change the world. Yeah, change it. Come on. The first thing we're going to do is take over the schools. Then we're going to... Jim paused to halt a fight in front of the stage and went into a new vocal riff, Away in India, as the band vamped on a blues progression. For the next 5 minutes, Jim spoke with the kids up front. He asked for a cigarette and dozens were thrown on stage. He told the crowd he was from Florida. You know I was born right here in this state. You know that. Yeah, I was born right here in Melbourne, Florida in 1943. He went on in this vein, insisting he wasn't talking about no revolution, no demonstration. He grabbed at his crotch, teasing the crowd. Someone yelled, "Take it off." Hecklers began to curse as Jim chanted more anarchic exhortations and eventually concluded When the Music's Over. Then he screamed, "Wake up," and recited the Lizard stanza, which led into Light My Fire. During the solos, Jim's friend Louis Beach Marvin, the Topanga Supermarket Premium Air, handed Jim a live lamb. Marvin had planned to follow the Doors tour with the lamb, which he regarded as a symbol of the vegan pacifism he espoused. Jim held the lamb to his chest. 5,000 flashbulbs went off. Later, he remembered being surprised that the lamb was so placid and unafraid. He couldn't even feel its heart beating. As the band finished Light My Fire, Jim began grabbing at his private parts and exhorting the crowd to come up on the stage. All right, I want to see some action out there. He yelled this 5 times. I want to see you people come up on here and have some fun. Come on now, let's get on up here. No limits, no laws. Come on, let's do it. People jumped on the stage. Someone poured champagne over Jim's head. Off mic, Jim asked the kids if they wanted to see his private region and began unbuckling his belt. Everyone could see he was wearing boxer shorts, which interested the band because Jim hardly ever wore underwear. Vince, Ray Manzarek yelled over to Vince Trenor, the tour manager, "Don't let him do it." And Trenor ran on stage and stuck his thumbs in the waistband of Jim's leather pants. That way he couldn't pull them down. Nevertheless, Jim continued to posture sexually on stage. Thousands of flashbulbs recorded the scene. Promoter Ken Collier ran on the stage and told Jim, "Someone's gonna get hurt." Jim brushed him off and yelled, "We're not leaving until everyone gets their rocks off." Jim grabbed his underregion and seemed about to take off his pants when Collier's brother tried to take the microphone away. Jim pushed him off stage. One of the local karate guys then grabbed Jim and flipped him over his back into the crowd, who caught him. Landing on his feet, Jim led the audience in a wild pagan snake dance around the cavernous room. In Bill Siddon's words, the band manager, the audience looked like a giant whirlpool with Jim at the center. Then, the stage itself began to tilt and collapse. John and Robbie stopped playing and ran for the dressing room. When John jumped off the sinking stage, he landed on the light board, which crashed apart in a sparking fury. Ray Manzarek recalled the following in an interview 25 years later. It was Dionysus calling forth the snakes. The stage was collapsing. I played the riot, screaming, crunching chords. Part of me was saying, we're in serious trouble here. But I knew that Jim never actually exposed himself. What happened in Miami was a mass hallucination. After the shirt had been ripped from his back, Jim extricated himself from the Bachanal, followed by local photographer Jeff Simon, who snapped a picture of a bleary, bare-chested Jim on the balcony a few moments later, surveying with dazed satisfaction the aftermath of the chaotic scene he had orchestrated. The Miami concert and the Doors as originally conceived were over. Not much was said after that disastrous and fateful Miami show in March of 1969. It was, after all, just another royally screwed-up Doors gig. The band even laughed off the show with the off-duty Miami cops who were providing security backstage. Jim had sobered up and spoke about wanting to change the band's direction. When the hall was emptied, discarded clothes, underwear, and shoes were swept into the middle of the floor in a huge pile, measuring 5 feet high. The Doors road crew rounded up their amps and prepared to truck them to the band's next gig in Jacksonville, Florida on March 9th. However, there was trouble in Miami now. Larry Mahoney was a young reporter from the Miami Herald who had been a student at FSU at the same time as Jim and may have known him there. 2 days after the Miami show, Mahoney began writing inflammatory articles about the Doors' appearance, one of which suggested that Jim Morrison had exposed himself at the Dinner Key Auditorium. In his write-up entitled, "Rock Group Fails to Stir a Riot" on March 3rd, Mahoney reported that Jim flouted the laws of obscenity, indecent exposure, and incitement to riot. In Mahoney's words, quote, "Many of the nearly 12,000 youth said they found the bearded singer's exhibition disgusting. Included in the audience were hundreds of unescorted junior and senior high school girls. Morrison appeared to expose himself. He also got violent, slugged several of the Image officials, and threw one of them off the stage before he himself was hurled into the crowd." End quote. The band's tour manager Vince Trenor saw this article before he left Miami and called manager Bill Siddons in alarm. They both knew that Jim hadn't unveiled his considerable manhood. Neither had taken their eyes off him during the performance. Larry Mahoney then began leading a press campaign against the Doors. He called Miami's acting police chief and asked reporter-type questions. He called the Dade County District Attorney. Did they know a rock star had exposed himself in Coconut Grove? The cops tried to defend themselves, saying they had been too busy dealing with 2,500 ticketless fans outside the hall to arrest the star of the show. The FBI dossier concerning Jim Morrison contains a report on the show. The name of the informant is blacked out. Drawing on Mahoney's reporting, the informant declared that Jim exposed himself. Quote, "Informant advised that he is conducting an investigation and warrants will be obtained for Morrison's arrest on misdemeanor charges. The matter will be discussed with the Florida State Attorney's Office to determine if Morrison can be charged with a felony." End quote. On March 5th, Mahoney reported that the Miami police had issued an arrest warrant for Jim, charging indecent exposure and disorderly conduct by profanity. An assistant state attorney was said to have taken a statement from one of his office boys that Jim had displayed his private and that the state of Florida was considering pressing charges. It was all rubbish. There were several professional photographers covering the concert that night and thousands of flash cameras. The only image that comes close to indecent exposure is one where Jim has one hand in his pants and another reaching for his crotch. But regardless, Jim Morrison was in big trouble, much bigger than anyone realized. Officials at both the FBI and in the White House still believe that Jim had made threats against the famously paranoid Nixon. The FBI's notorious COINTELPRO operation was currently neutralizing, sometimes violently, the government's critics and perceived enemies. They were already harassing John Lennon, who had made outrageous statements against Nixon's policies. The thuggish prosecution and subsequent police threats against Jim Morrison jibe with what details can be gleaned from his censored FBI file to indicate that the director of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, may have had a hand in the persecution of Jim Morrison. Meanwhile, the Doors' lucrative tour was suddenly canceled. The Concert Halls Management Association, CHMA, put out the word that the Doors were poison. Their insurance company canceled their policies. Big money dates in Jacksonville, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Providence, Toronto, Detroit, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Boston, Buffalo, Dallas, Houston, and others were immediately spiked. Suddenly, almost mysteriously, the Doors dropped off the radio, as if they've been banned from airplay. The band's manager Bill Siddons reached the group who were vacationing in the Caribbean and told them that the tour was off, suggesting they return to LA instead. Jim was warned that he could be arrested if he landed in Florida, so he caught a flight to New York instead on March 8th. At this time in early March of 1969, everyone around the Doors was completely freaked out about the canceled tour and the enormous loss of revenue, all of which happened as a result of the controversy coming from the Miami show, except for Jim Morrison. He seemed relieved. The whole thing had been on his shoulders and now he was free. He came home to LA and met with his lawyers about what to do. He kept growing his beard, put on some weight, and dressed down. On and off girlfriend Pamela Corson supposedly told friends that Jim had admitted to her that he had flashed his meat in Miami. She asked him why he had done it, and Jim said, "Honey, I just wanted to see what it looked like in the spotlight." This is probably apocryphal, an exaggeration, but Elmer Valentine, who owned the whiskey, also claimed that Jim told him he thought he might have fished it out. With time on his hands, Jim immersed himself in other interests. He published the poem Dry Water in the Los Angeles Image, a counterculture magazine. Sometime in March, the tapes are undated, Jim gathered his notebooks and taped more than an hour's worth of poems, lyrics, and fragments in either Elektra Studio or at Sunset Sound. The engineer was John Haney, who had been Elektra's chief engineer since the beginning of the year. This recording session yielded 40 spoken-word Morrison poems, some of which, Bird of Prey, Under Waterfall, Orange Country, were sung by Jim a cappella as if musical accompaniment could be recorded later. Among the pieces were Indians Scattered on Dawn's Highway, sections of An American Prayer, 2 verses of Texas Radio, Stoned Immaculate, and Motel Money Murder Madness. There were also several fragments that were later united into a posthumous poem, Far Arden. Arden was the family name of William Shakespeare's mother, and the Forest of Arden is the setting for William Shakespeare's play As You Like It. Jim spoke, chanted, and sang in a bell-clear baritone, reading from his notebooks in carefully thought-out cadences, as if he had rehearsed material he had repeatedly polished and refined. Some have speculated that these tapes were meant to be released in some form if Jim went to jail for the Miami concert. Portions of these poems were eventually adapted and used by the Doors to carry on Jim's image long after he had died. Poets and critics who have heard these visionary taped experiments agree that Jim Morrison was creating a new American poetry that worked on a very high level, one that didn't necessarily transpose successfully to the printed page. Ray Manzarek claims the Doors confronted Jim about his drinking at a band meeting at Robbie's parents' house in the Pacific Palisades, where the Doors had worked on some of the soft parade songs. In his memoir, Ray said they had all told him he was drinking too much and that it looked like he was killing himself. According to Manzarek, Jim acknowledged his problem, saying simply and sadly, "I know I drink too much, Ray. I'm trying to quit." That was enough for the Doors. Jim knew it was what they wanted to hear, so he didn't quit. He just kept boozing with Babe Hill at the Palms. Max Fink, Jim Morrison's Beverly Hills attorney, was contacted by the Federal Bureau of Investigation late in March concerning criminal charges against Jim relating to the Doors' Miami concert. The FBI got a federal judge to issue a warrant for Jim, citing interstate flight to avoid prosecution. This was absurd, since Jim had left Florida before any charges had been filed, and Florida only declared him a fugitive of justice in a warrant signed by Governor Claude R. Kirk Jr. on April 18th. Fink was getting the distinct impression that somebody in the FBI wanted Jim Morrison put away in prison. The situation was extremely serious and potentially very dangerous for Jim. On or about Friday, April 4th, 1969, Jim Morrison and Max Fink arrived at the FBI's downtown Los Angeles office, where Jim was arrested. By prior arrangement, a U.S. magistrate immediately released James Douglas Morrison, an active service admiral's son and major heavy-duty American rock star, on $5,000 bail. On August 6, 1970, Jim Morrison and his entourage, lawyer Max Fink and bodyguards Babe Hill and Tony Fuentes, flew to Miami and checked into the Carlin Resort Hotel in Miami Beach. They were joined by Mike Gershman, a publicist whose Los Angeles firm also represented the Rolling Stones. The other Doors, who were expected to testify at Jim's trial, arrived a few days later. The proceedings were supposed to begin on Monday, August 10th, but were postponed for 2 days. The judge was Murray Goodman, and Jim wasn't helped by the fact that the judge hated Jim's local attorney, Robert Josephsberg, or that 62-year-old Max Fink referred to Miami as, quote, one of the most immoral cities in the United States during a press conference. The county's prosecutor was a relatively hip young assistant state attorney, Terrence McWilliams, who sucked up to Jim, asking for signed copies of his records while doing his best to send him to prison. The judge made it clear early on that he wasn't going to postpone the trial so that the Doors could play shows, so the band reluctantly canceled their European tour scheduled for early September in 1970. The whole scene in the Metro-Dade Justice Building had the stink of corruption to it. It was obvious to Miami's veteran legal observers that Jim Morrison was being railroaded to prison under the watchful eye of the Nixon administration. Somebody was out to break the Doors financially and physically, and it became apparent that no one in the media was going to stand up for Jim Morrison in his hour of need. The 6-person jury was sworn in on August 14, 1970. That night, Jim and his crew went to see John Fogerty's hard-rocking band Creedence Clearwater Revival play in Miami Beach. Then, they went to The Hump, a hotel club, to see Canned Heat play. Bob Hitt called Jim up to the stage, where he did Backdoor Man and other blues tunes for almost an hour. They had to push past the crush of TV crews, radio reporters, and fans on Monday, August 17th. The nationally famous thief, Murph the Surf, was being tried on a robbery charge in the adjacent courtroom. Jim sat at the defense table, taking notes as the testimony began. After opening statements, during which Max Fink claimed the charges against Jim were baseless and motivated by unsavory local politics, 2 witnesses, Betty Racine and Colleen Clary, testified that Jim Morrison had exposed himself for 10 seconds, according to the ponytail drugstore cashier, Miss Clary. Another prosecution witness, the one who had signed the original complaint, turned out to be an employee in the prosecutor's office. Max Fink picked their stories apart during cross-examination and asked the court to be allowed to present community standards evidence exposing the jury to the public nudity of the Woodstock movie and the Miami production of Hair. The following day, photographer Jeff Simon, who was 5 feet away from Jim during the entire concert in March of 1970, where this infamous situation took place, or rather didn't take place, testified that he didn't see Jim whip it out. More than 100 of Simon's photos were introduced as evidence. On August 20th, Judge Goodman ruled that community standards were irrelevant to this case. With the jury excused, Fink excoriated the judge's ruling, drawing applause from the spectators. But the ruling stood. The Doors played 2 California shows that weekend. Friday night in Bakersfield, the kids were packed in front of the stage like penned animals and the Doors played for 3 hours. Jim bore down, concentrating furiously, performing Celebration with careful enunciation, requesting cigarettes from the audience, and consuming maybe a gallon of beer. The next night in San Diego, he introduced the show by yelling, "This whole thing started with rock and roll and now it's out of control." Again, the Doors played a great show, which no one would have known would be the last of its kind, the end of an era that had begun 5 years earlier in the hopeful sunshine of a summer's day on Venice Beach. Judge Goodman's Kangaroo Court reconvened on Tuesday, August 25th. A female police officer testified that the cops had been afraid to arrest Jim because they thought it would provoke a riot. Max Fink pointed out that the arrest could have been made after the show, but that nothing had happened. Fink insisted that a media-fueled hysteria had eventually forced police to file charges against an innocent artist. 2 days later, the prosecution played the jury the tape of the show, which sounded coarse, seditious, and chaotic, but offered no proof that Jim had displayed his regenerative organ. Judge Goodman then adjourned for the weekend so the Doors could perform at the Isle of Wight Festival off the south coast of England, one of the last great outdoor events of the decade. Jim Morrison was back in Miami for the resumption of the legal proceedings against him on September 2nd, 1970. The Isle of Wight show was to have been the start of a lucrative European tour that would have taken the band to Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and Paris. All the dates had been cancelled because of Jim's trial commitments. The atmosphere in off-season Miami was subdued, even morose. The scene at the trial was totally weird. The prosecution rested on September 2nd. Max Fink had 60 rebuttal witnesses. The judge ruled that he could present only 17. The next day, the judge declared an 11-day recess, infuriating the band, which had cancelled its tour. The trial was costing a fortune in both money and morale. Jim wanted to return to LA because Pamela Corson sounded so stoned on the telephone, slurring her words or laughing uncontrollably, but the lawyers talked him out of it. Patricia Kennelly also arrived in Miami, claiming that Jim had married her and that she was pregnant. Jim's bodyguard Babe had asked him about this. "I don't know what I did," Jim told him. "I was drunk. Maybe I did, but there was no emotional involvement with her." The tension at the Carolyn Hotel was diabolical, so Jim and his crew, Babe Hill, Frank Lisiandro, and Max Fink, retreated to the Bahamas for a few days of fishing, snorkeling, and drinking rum. Back in Miami, they went to an Elvis Presley concert at the huge convention center, strobe lit by instamatic flashes, during which Elvis strutted and posed in a succession of iconic tableaux. Jim was impressed by Elvis's great band, which included guitarist James Burton, drummer Ronnie Tutt, and bassist Jerry Sheff. The local press was particularly craven about Jim's legal ordeal in their town. The Miami News reported the following. Attired in a tan suede jacket with sheepskin lining, Morrison looked like a ranch hand in search of a barber. An unidentified friend was far more flamboyantly attired in tapestry coat and rust-colored bell-bottoms, end quote. The papers sent young reporters to cover the trial, and they would approach Jim in the hallways almost on bended knee, according to Mike Gershman, as if Jim were taboo or not quite real. Their questions were shallow and useless, the TV coverage was dumb, and no one bothered to notice that a major political fix was in. Then again, a lot of people in Miami thought Jim Morrison was getting what he deserved, and maybe even what he wanted. A few months later, Jim told Rolling Stone's Ben Fong Torres, "You know, I thought there was a possibility of it becoming a major groundbreaking kind of case, but it didn't turn out that way. It actually received very little national attention. And in a way, I was kind of relieved because as the case moved on, there were no great ideals at stake." A high school student, Steve Rosenberg, attended the trial almost every day. When the crowds died out as the case dragged on, Jim noticed him in the hallways and answered Steve's respectful questions about what poetry he liked, Rimbaud, and what music he was listening to, Pink Floyd. During a recess, Jim asked if there was a Burger King around, and Steve drove him to the nearest one in his mother's '63 Chrysler Newport. Jim liked the car. "Cool air conditioning," he commented. "Really blows a lot of air." He had 2 whoppers and a thick shake. He was fat, bearded, and a little spacey, Rosenberg recalled. I had to draw him out. Then I just drove him back to the courthouse. Court reconvened on September 14th. The legal proceedings and witnesses were so boring that Jim stopped taking notes. Jim testified 2 days later, the other Doors the day after that. The judge was being a hard-nose and the press ignored the trial. The Doors' own publicist filed stories for Rock magazine, which came out weeks later. Jim's mood sank to a new low on September 19th when word of Jimi Hendrix's death in London got out. Jim and Babe were both tripping on acid when they heard Hendrix had died. The official version was that Hendrix had swallowed a handful of Quaaludes and had choked to death when he vomited while in a coma. But it was well known in the music business that Hendrix was leaving his manager and so was worth more dead than alive to certain people. After the moves to dismiss, denied, the closing arguments, and Judge Goodman's highly unorthodox directive to find the defendant guilty, the jury returned with its verdicts on September 20th, 1970. Jim Morrison was found guilty on misdemeanor counts of indecent exposure and open profanity. He was acquitted of public drunkenness and of the felony charge of lewd and lascivious behavior. None of this made any sense. The whole trial had been a farce. Goodman had already commented in open court while the jury was deliberating that there was no real evidence that Jim had exposed himself. Sentencing was postponed until October. Jim's bail was raised to $50,000 and now he faced an almost certain prison sentence that could get the judge reelected as a Nixonian law and order enforcer. This new bail order came down on a Sunday evening so that it would be hard for Jim to make his bond and he could be jailed overnight. But Max Fink had been prepared for this. He had several certified bank checks in various amounts at the ready so the cops couldn't get Jim behind bars. The lawyers told Jim not to worry. They would win on appeal. Jim talked to the press after the verdict. "This won't affect my style," he told the Miami Herald. "I maintain I didn't do anything wrong." Max now told Jim to get out of Florida immediately. But Jim was in no hurry to get back to Los Angeles. Pamela had fallen apart and was in chronic heroin use. Pam was said by her friends to have been suicidally depressed in Jim's absence. Jim now elected to drive back to California with Babe Hill for company, and they took their sweet time. Jim wanted to visit his old haunts, so they stopped in Clearwater, where Jim had been in junior college. Both got thrown in jail for a few hours when Jim started a bar fight. Let loose, they drove on to Tallahassee, where an unusually nostalgic Jim stopped at the motel where he had lived as an FSU student. Then they drove straight to New Orleans, where they tarried for a few days and got, in Babe's words, as drunk as a couple of walruses. Touring the city, Jim bought a postcard at St. Louis Cathedral and mailed it to the Doors' office. "Don't worry," he wrote, "the end is near." Haha. Jim visited Congo Square, site of the old slave market and the place where African rhythms were first heard in America. One night he got up and jammed the blues with one of the bar bands in the French Quarter, thanking them politely when he'd sung his fill. These musicians later mutated into Kansas, a successful touring band of the early 70s. In Tennessee, Jim and Babe got busted at a speed trap. They had to follow the cop to the county courthouse where the judge let them go for $100 in cash. In October of 1970, Jim Morrison drove into a Los Angeles scored dry by the easterly Santa Ana winds. "I see your hair is burning," he wrote. "Hills are filled with fire. If they say I never loved you, you know they are a liar." End quote. Now, as mentioned, right before this incident in Miami, Pamela and Jim Morrison were yet again having another episode in their relationship where things were off balance. Did their volatile relationship contribute to Jim behaving that way on stage? Maybe not directly, but given the fact that there was always this chaos in Jim's life with his relationship, maybe that constant chaos created the right mindset to be able to do what Jim allegedly did on stage. Now, with that said, even if Pamela wasn't in Jim's life, he was already a chaotic person. And Jim had plenty of other unhealthy relationships over the course of his life, so it's not fair to blame Pamela for what happened in Miami, but perhaps their volatile relationship may have played some sort of a contributing factor to Jim's behavior. In any case, as some of you may know, I have covered Jim and Pam's relationship on this channel a few different times. For those of you who may not have seen those videos, I want to quickly recap the crazy relationship Jim and Pamela had. First, I'm going to read to you an article by Marco Margaritov. This is from allthat'sinteresting.com. Quote, "Pamela Corson embodied the free spirit of the hippie generation. An art school dropout, she was determined to pursue art on her own terms and make a name for herself. But ultimately, she's mostly remembered for being Jim Morrison's girlfriend. The beautiful Californian had already embraced the counterculture movement by the time she met the Doors frontman in 1965. So it's little wonder why she was so attracted to the wild rock star. The pair quickly became a couple, but the relationship of Pamela Courson and Jim Morrison was far from a fairy tale. From drug abuse to repeated infidelities to explosive arguments, their relationship was the definition of tumultuous and sometimes even escalated into violence. Yet Morrison and Courson always seemed to find a way to reconcile. By 1971, the couple had decided to move to Paris together, but tragically, they were only there for a few months before Jim Morrison's death at the age of 27. And nearly 3 years later, Pamela Courson would meet an eerily similar fate. Pamela Courson was born on December 22, 1946, in Weed, California. Though her interior design mother and junior high school principal father were kind and caring, Courson wanted more than a white picket fence. As a young adult in the mid-60s, Courson studied art at Los Angeles City College, but the rigors of academia felt constraining to her, and she soon dropped out. It was around that same time that she met Jim Morrison. As the story goes, Pamela Courson found herself at a Hollywood nightclub called London Fog, attending one of the earliest shows that the Doors played in the city. Courson and Morrison were instantly drawn to each other. By the time Light My Fire hit the scene in 1967, the couple had already moved in together in Los Angeles. Meanwhile, the Doors keyboardist Ray Manzarek confessed that he, quote, never knew another person who could so complement Morrison's bizarreness, end quote. After just a year of living together, the couple made plans to marry. In December of 1967, Pamela Courson obtained a marriage license in Denver, Colorado, while she was on the road with the Doors. But Courson failed to have the license filed or notarized, causing her plans to fall through. Instead of trying elsewhere at another time, Morrison surprised her with full access to his money. He also agreed to finance Themis, the fashion boutique that Courson had dreamt of opening. With a high-profile clientele that included Sharon Tate and Miles Davis, Courson's career had taken off in tandem with her boyfriend's. Sadly, the couple was fighting constantly, often fueled by alcohol and drug abuse. One former neighbor of the couple said, "One night, Pam came over late claiming Jim had tried to kill her. She said he had pushed her into the closet and set it on fire when he found out she had been sleeping with this phony prince who had supplied her with heroin." Meanwhile, Morrison became increasingly dependent on alcohol, and it showed in his performances. In 1969, he was even accused of exposing himself on stage in Miami. While it's still debated whether Morrison actually exposed himself that night, there was no question that his addictions were getting the better of him. One of the reasons Morrison moved to Paris with Courson, hoping for a change of scenery. In Paris, Morrison seemed to find peace and take care of himself better, so it came as a shock when he died just months after arriving. But not everyone was surprised. While in the city, Morrison and Courson had indulged in old habits and frequented many notorious nightclubs. On July 3, 1971, Pamela Courson found Jim Morrison immobile and unresponsive in the bathtub of their Paris apartment. When the police arrived, she said that he had woken up in the middle of the night feeling sick and started a hot bath. Morrison was soon declared dead of heart failure. Thought to be brought on by drugs, some believe it may have been heroin. But not everyone buys the official story. From whispers that he died in the bathroom of a nightclub to rumors that he faked his own death, Morrison's demise has been the subject of numerous conspiracy theories. But perhaps most ominously, some people have accused his girlfriend of playing a role in his death, especially since Courson was the sole heir in his will. While Courson was interviewed by the police, they apparently took her story at face value, and no autopsy was ever performed. Still, Courson was never officially suspected of anything related to her boyfriend's death. After he was buried, she simply returned to Los Angeles alone, and due to the legal battles, she never saw a dime of Morrison's fortune. In the years after Morrison's death, Courson's own addictions grew rapidly worse. She often described herself as Jim Morrison's wife, despite the fact they had never been married, and sometimes even delusionally claimed that he was about to call her. Nearly 3 years later, in April of 1974, she suffered the same fate as the Doors frontman. She died at age 27 of a heroin overdose. End of article. Jim and Pam cheated on each other many times over the years. According to one of the women that Jim Morrison cheated on Pamela Courson with, he actually enjoyed getting caught cheating by Pamela. He apparently enjoyed seeing her angry reaction. He got a kick out of it. Knowing all that we know about Jim Morrison, that doesn't seem like a stretch. The person who said this is Pam Miller, also known as Pamela DeBarge, one of the most famous rock and roll groupies ever. According to her, on one specific occasion in 1967, Pamela Courson walked in on her and Jim. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life Death Legend by Stephen Davis. I have a lot of Doors and specifically Jim Morrison videos on my channel. If you want to help me make more videos, the best way to do so is to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching. Quote, Jim was still living part-time with the tourists, hookers, and Hollywood hopefuls at the rowdy Tropicana Motel, but he spent many nights in Pam's candlelit apartment in the ramshackle greenhouse in Laurel Canyon. He liked to get up around 2 in the afternoon, scratch himself, and get a beer if there were any in the fridge. Then he'd put on his acetate copy of the as-yet unreleased The Doors, and play it as loud as the neighbors could take it. The first time he did this, it attracted the surprised attention of naked except for panties Pamela Miller, one of Frank and Gail Zappa's brazen teenage babysitters, who was staying next door with a friend named Sandy. Miss Pamela recalled, I'd seen The Doors 100 times by then, and I really wanted to get to know Jim because I'd never seen such a blatant sexuality on stage before. And I was really surprised to hear this music coming out of this green shack behind the country store, because I knew The Doors had recorded an album, but it hadn't been released yet. So I slipped on my purple little dress, walked barefoot down the stone steps between our houses to see what ultra-hip neighbor had an advanced pressing of The Doors record. I tiptoed up on the old wooden porch and peeked in the window of the room that Crystal Ship was coming from. I stifled a scream as my eyes adjusted to the dark, and Jim Morrison came into focus, in the flesh, his hair mussed up, and wearing nothing but a pair of black pants. I was so flustered, I ran back to the pad where I was staying and tried to figure out what to do. A little earlier, I'd been given a quart bottle of a tranquilizer called Trimar by the bass player of Iron Butterfly, who had a day job working in a hospital. This stuff was used to block labor pains, and even a little bit poured on a handkerchief and inhaled made me feel like Alice falling down the rabbit hole. I grabbed the Trimar and negotiated the steps, got up on the porch, and bravely knocked on the door. When Jim answered, I smiled and introduced myself. What you got there? He asked, nodding at the bottle of clear liquid I was holding. When I next came to my senses, my purple velvet mini dress was over my head, and then suddenly there was his redhead girlfriend glaring at me with a look of pure hatred in her pretty eyes. I looked over at Jim. He had backed into a dark corner of the room, about to enjoy what he figured would be one of Pam's jealous tantrums. He was murmuring to her, get it on, get it on, get it on. It was one of those classic uh-oh moments. I stood up and offered the redhead a shot of the Trimar, but she just turned her back and told me I'd be better to leave. I went back up to Sandy's pad. Just as I got in the door, I heard Pam screaming, "Don't you dare go up there, Jim Morrison. Don't you dare." But he was already at the door, smiling shyly, extremely interested in another blast of the Trimar. Social niceties forgotten, we spent the rest of the afternoon and evening sniffing the stuff, sitting on the floor, laughing at everything and getting to know each other. I ran out of the stuff early the next morning, and Jim wished us a pleasant good night and politely thanked Sandy for her hospitality. What a gentleman. I was disappointed that he made no attempt to lay a hand on me, but now that we were friends, I had high hopes for the future, as long as that redhead wasn't around. End quote. Now, of course, Pamela Corson's life wasn't just significant to Jim Morrison. She also had a major impact on The Doors in many regards. I want to focus particularly for a moment on Jim Morrison's death. After he died, it opened up a lot of questions as to who had ownership of what exactly, what legally belonged to who. Pamela Corson was a key figure in this discussion. The following is from my documentary, The Doors After Jim Morrison. If you want to see the full documentary, the link is available in the description box below. Again, all the videos on my channel are original. If you want to help me make more videos, the best way is to subscribe to the channel. Now, Jim and Pamela, of course, were living together in Paris at the time of Jim's death, and Pamela is the last person known to have seen Jim alive. Pamela was using heroin, and Jim is said to have taken some of Pam's heroin that night, apparently mistaking it initially for cocaine. Pamela's main supplier was her other on-again, off-again boyfriend, Jean de Breteuil, a rich French count who, by the way, is said to have also supplied the heroin which killed Janis Joplin. In any case, Jim was not used to heroin, and according to many, it was the heroin that night which did ultimately kill him. Officially, Jim Morrison's death is listed as heart failure, but unofficially, many people believe it was heroin. More on that later. In any case, Pamela Corson was Jim Morrison's live-in girlfriend, and after Jim's death, Pamela made the case that she was actually Jim's common-law wife. Being Jim Morrison's widow would have legal ramifications when it came to Jim Morrison's estate. The following is from Doors biographer Jerry Hopkins. Quote, in 1971, 4 months after Jim died, in an effort to bolster her claim and to be granted an allowance and an advance from the estate, which was still then in probate, Pam filed a, quote, declaration in support of widow's allowance, claiming that all time since September 30th of 67, I have considered that I was married to James D. Morrison, and that I was in fact his wife at the time of his death and am now his widow. It was in 1967, as Light My Fire was finally dropping off the charts, that Pam said she and Jim spent the night in Colorado Springs. Earlier, she had Jim ask Doors lawyer Max Fink which U.S. states had the loosest laws recognizing common law marriage. In her court statement, Pam said, quote, Jim reported to me that he learned from an attorney that to create a marriage in the state of Colorado, it was sufficient if two people stayed together, had marital relations, and agreed to thereby be husband and wife, if, in fact, they thereafter conducted and held themselves out as each other's spouse. Jim and I spent the night at a hotel, had sexual relations, and agreed that we would forever be husband and wife. We very briefly honeymooned in Colorado and then continued our Doors tour. In December of 1971, the three surviving Doors filed papers of their own in court, making claims against the Morrison estate. Then, in April of 74, the Doors came back with another lawsuit. Eventually, a compromise was reached, though. Then, as the final accounting of the estate was being made, Pam died. A heroin overdose on April 25, 1971. If she had lived, she would have received about $500,000 right away, plus a quarter of everything the Doors would make in the future, a sum that subsequently proved to be worth millions. Pam died without a will, which meant her quarter share of all future Doors earnings went to her next of kin, her parents. Almost immediately, Jim's parents entered the fray, demanding their fair share as stated in the California Probate Code. On January 10, 1975, the two sets of parents signed an agreement dividing equally the proceeds from Jim's quarter share of all Doors revenue. But it was 1979 before all the loose ends were tied up and the parents started receiving any money. End quote. The following is from Jim Morrison, Life, Death, Legend by Stephen Davis, where he discusses Pamela Courson's death and the subsequent legal fallout. Quote, Pamela Courson returned to Los Angeles a few days after Jim died and proceeded to play out a 3-year Ophelia-like mad scene. Reliable information about Pamela from this period is often unsupported and scarce since she lived in a demi-mundane life in a shadowy milieu of addiction, grief, and occasional mania. After recovering from her Parisian ordeal, she tried to resume her life in LA as Pamela Morrison. She talked to her dog as if she was talking to Jim. She always spoke of Jim in the present as if he were alive. The accountant informed her that Jim's estate, to which she was indeed the sole heir, could not continue to support her boutique, Themis, until the will was adjudicated, which could go on for years. Themis would have to close. Pamela became so enraged by this that she drove a car into the front window of the store. In November of 1971, she filed papers formally claiming the Jim Morrison estate, which was reported to include holdings in oil wells and California ranch land. The other Doors immediately sued Jim's estate for what they claimed were large outstanding cash advances that had been paid to Jim. The ensuing litigation left Pamela almost penniless. Pamela relocated to the Bay Area in 1972. She stayed in Bolinas with Ellen Sander for a while. Then she lived with some friends in Sausalito. Racked by crippling spasms of guilt, she would sit for hours by the telephone waiting for my old man to call. Ray Manzarek ran into her in Sausalito and wanted to ask her what happened in Paris. But when she saw him, she swooned in a paroxysm of grief and could only weep in his arms. A bit later, she contacted Jim's literary friend Michael McClure about Jim's remaining poetry. She loaned him the leather portmanteau, which she described as a doctor's bag that contained Jim's poems and notes, each filled in a binder and carefully arranged. McClure later returned the bag, expressing surprise at what he later called a miracle of order, and told Pamela that he felt the works could be published. Eventually, Pamela returned to Los Angeles. She had affairs with a younger rock star and an older French diplomat. She continued to have serious cash flow problems and a taste for heroin. To survive, she sold her jewelry, Jim's books, and anything that wasn't nailed down, though she managed to keep her small collection of Luger pistols. She was evicted from her house in the Hollywood Hills for non-payment of rent and moved into a garden apartment in West Hollywood. Paul Rothschild said that she used to turn up at his house at all hours, well supplied with barbiturates and heroin. She spent much of her time with Paul Rothschild crying. She kept saying over and over, "I just couldn't control him." Pamela had a lot of enemies. Some believe she had killed Jim Morrison for his money. There were people who were content to see her in extreme distress. They put out rumors that she was prostituting herself, but tracking these rumors always leads back to people who hated her. She may have been kept for a time by the rich Frenchman. Others swore or wrote in thinly sourced books that Pamela had confessed to killing Jim accidentally, that he had snorted massive lines of what she told him was cocaine, but which was actually China White. No one put it past her or stood up to say that it couldn't have happened. The Doors litigated Pamela for years. She had no money at all and had to be supported by family and friends. Lawsuits flew like bats at sunset until early 1974, when it looked like there would be finally a settlement. Then the Doors sued the estate again, prolonging the agony. In April, the court recognized Pamela as James Douglas Morrison's lawful heir, and a full settlement was reached with the Doors. Pamela's initial cash disbursement, hurried through to relieve obvious financial distress, was $20,000. Friends say Pamela seemed a little better after things were settled. Others say she was more despondent than ever. She bought a cherry chrome yellow Volkswagen Beetle. She went to Saks Fifth Avenue and bought a monogram ranch mink stole. She phoned her connection and reportedly ordered an ounce of China White. The people she lived with found her dead on the living room couch on the afternoon of April 25, 1974. At first, they thought she was just taking a nap and let her sleep for hours until it began to get weird. Then, they noticed she wasn't breathing. The cops arrived. A man living in the house who said he used to drive for Jim and Pamela was questioned about Pamela's use of heroin. He volunteered that her quote-unquote husband had died of a heroin overdose in Paris 3 years earlier, and that Pamela had recently spoken about looking forward to seeing him again soon. When they took her away, her long red hair cascaded over the side of the gurney as she was being lifted into the ambulance. The coroner could have called Pamela's death a suicide, but called it a massive pulmonary edema instead. The autopsy noted that she had a severe bladder infection. Ray Manzarek was asked to play at a memorial service for both Pamela and Jim, organized by the Corsons at Forest Lawn Cemetery on Monday, April 29th. Ray played When the Music's Over, Love Street, and Crystal Ship. Pamela's apartment was burglarized during the ceremony, and an unknown amount of Jim's effects were reportedly stolen. It is not known whether there was talk of burying Pamela's ashes with Jim in Paris, but they were later interred in a memory wall under the name Pamela Morrison in an Orange County cemetery. A week later, a probate judge officially awarded Pamela $500,000 and a quarter of the Doors' future royalty income, making the dead girl a virtual millionaire. It later emerged that her family suspected that Pamela might have been murdered, with suspicion reportedly following on a former in-law member of the Morrison family. An investigation produced no actionable results. Since Pamela had died without leaving a will, Jim Morrison's entire estate, including the executorship of his literary and artistic remains, passed to Pamela's parents, Corky and Marie Corson. Sometime after Jim Morrison's father, Admiral Morrison, retired from the Navy in 1975, the Morrisons sued for a share of their son's legacy. Several years later, a settlement awarded the Morrisons half of the financial worth of the estate, but left Jim's artistic legacy in the control of the Corsons.